The fence was still standing when Delia Holloway came home that Tuesday evening, and something about the sight of those fresh-cut pine posts driven deep into the red Arizona earth made her chest tight with an emotion she could not immediately name. It was not gratitude. It was something older and more dangerous than gratitude. She stood at the edge of her property with her market basket hanging from one arm and the last orange light of the 1882 sunset turning everything to copper and fire, and she stared at what Roscoe Kendrick had built while she was away, and she felt the ground shift beneath her feet the way it does before an earthquake, the way it does before everything you thought was solid turns out to be nothing but dust and intention. She had not asked for a fence. She had not asked for anything. That was the problem. That was the truth that cracked something open in her chest and let the evening air in. Delia Holloway had spent 3 years on this quarter section of land outside the town of Redemption, Arizona, learning how not to ask for things, learning how not to need, learning how to look at a broken gate or a leaking roof or a field going dry and tell herself it was manageable, it was fine. She had hands and she had will, and she did not require anyone to ride in and fix what was broken. And Roscoe Kendrick had gone and built her a fence anyway. She turned and there he was, still on her land, still with sawdust on his forearms, and a look on his face that was so carefully arranged into something casual and indifferent that it was obviously neither. He was leaning against the corner post he had set himself, his hat tilted back, his dark eyes watching her with the stillness of a man who has already decided something and is merely waiting for the world to catch up to his decision. "You built a fence," she said. "I did," he said. "I did not ask you to build a fence." "No," he agreed. "You did not." The silence between them was the kind that has weight, the kind you could press a hand against and feel it push back. Delia set her basket down in the red dirt and crossed her arms and looked at him the way she had learned to look at men who presumed things, with a clear, cold steadiness that usually made them uncomfortable enough to back away. Roscoe Kendrick did not back away. "What else?" she said, and her voice was quiet and dangerous. "Do you plan to build?" He looked at her for a long moment. The sunset was doing things to his face that she did not want to think about. His jaw was strong and dark with several days of stubble, and his eyes held a warmth that seemed designed specifically to undermine her composure. He straightened away from the post and he looked at her property, her little house with the crooked chimney, her struggling vegetable garden, her patched-up barn with the door that never quite closed right, and then he looked back at her, and he said the word that changed everything. "Everything," he said. She had not been prepared for that. She had not been prepared for the simplicity of it, the completeness of it, the way he said it without flinching or qualifying or turning it into a question. He said it like a man who had already drawn the plans, already measured the ground, already decided in some quiet interior place that this was what he was going to do, and the only remaining variable was whether she would allow it. Delia Holloway, who had not cried since the day she buried her husband 2 years ago, felt something prick dangerously at the back of her eyes, and she picked up her basket and walked into her house and shut the door. And she stood in her dark kitchen with her heart hammering like a trapped bird, and she thought, with equal parts terror, and something she refused yet to call hope, that she was in a great deal of trouble. To understand why that word, that one small thunderclap of a word, could do that to a woman like Delia Holloway, you have to understand what she had survived. And to understand what she had survived, you have to go back 3.5 years, to the spring of 1879, to the train station in St. Louis, Missouri, where a 26-year-old woman with dark red hair, and a set to her chin that her mother had always called stubborn and her father had always called determined, stood with one trunk, one carpetbag, and one marriage certificate that was brand new and smelled of ink and false promises. His name had been Warren Holloway, and she had met him through an advertisement in the St. Louis Dispatch. He had written a letter so full of warmth and detail and specific tenderness that Delia, who had read it 17 times in her small room above her father's dry goods store, had allowed herself to believe in it completely. He wrote about the land in Arizona Territory, about the red earth and the impossible sky, about the house he was building with his own hands, about how he wanted a partner, a real partner, not just a woman to cook and clean, but someone with a mind and a backbone and a willingness to build something new. She had written back with equal honesty. She had told him she was not delicate. She had told him she had opinions and would voice them. She had told him she expected to be treated as an equal in the running of the property, that she had grown up working beside her father in the store and knew accounts and inventory and the value of honest labor. He had written back and said that was exactly what he needed, exactly what he had hoped for, and she had believed him. The reality of Warren Holloway had been somewhat different from his letters. He was not a cruel man. She needed to be honest about that, even now, even in the privacy of her own memory. He had never raised a hand to her. He had never spoken to her with deliberate contempt. But the warmth of his letters had belonged to a man he thought he might become, and the man who met her at the Redemption train station had already settled into a different, diminished version of himself. He drank. Not viciously, not with the desperate hunger of a man who had lost himself, but steadily, consistently, the way some men breathe, as though the alcohol was necessary for some basic function. And when he drank, the partnership he had promised dissolved into something more traditional and less equal, something in which he made the decisions and she was expected to support them. She had tried. She had genuinely tried. She had loved him, or something close enough to love that she had not been able to identify the difference at the time. She had run the house and kept the accounts and kept her opinions mostly to herself and told herself this was what marriage was. This was what the West required. This was adaptation. Then in the winter of 1880, Warren Holloway had gone out in a blizzard to check on the cattle and had not come back, and the hands had found him the next morning face down in the snow 300 yards from the barn, and the doctor in Redemption had said his heart had given out, likely from the cold, likely weakened already by the drinking, and Delia had stood at his grave in the frozen ground and had felt grief, genuine grief, alongside something else that she hated herself for feeling. Something that felt horribly like the first breath of air after being held underwater. She had been 27 years old, a widow, owner of a quarter section of land in Arizona Territory with a small herd of cattle, a vegetable garden, a leaking barn, and absolutely no intention of going back to St. Louis. The 2 years that followed had been the hardest and the best of her life simultaneously. The hardest because the work was punishing and solitary, and there were nights when she lay in the dark and could not imagine how she was going to continue. The best because every problem she solved was hers. Every fence post she drove, every account she balanced, every deal she negotiated at the mercantile in Redemption was evidence of a capacity she had always suspected in herself, but had never been fully permitted to exercise. She became known in Redemption as a fair dealer and a straight talker, and someone whose word was good, and she was proud of that in a way that ran deeper than anything Warren's compliments had ever reached. She had not been looking for anyone. She had not wanted anyone. She had been, in the most fundamental sense, complete. And then Roscoe Kendrick had ridden into Redemption in the spring of 1882, and nothing had been quite the same since. He arrived in March, on a day when the desert was just beginning to think about warmth, and he came with a reputation that preceded him by several weeks in the form of a letter from the town of Calder, 2 days' ride to the south. The letter was from the mayor of Calder, and it was addressed to the owner of the livery stable in Redemption, a man named Pete Dawson, who had a habit of reading other people's correspondence aloud at the saloon. According to Pete Dawson's reading, Roscoe Kendrick had spent 2 years in Calder as a hired hand, had built half the fences and fixed half the roofs, and mended half the wagons in the county, and had left suddenly in February, and the mayor wanted to know if anyone had seen him because several people in Calder owed him wages that he had left uncollected. The detail about the uncollected wages interested Delia more than it probably should have. She was in the saloon that evening, not for the whiskey but because Pete Dawson also ran the informal postal service, and she was picking up a letter from her mother. And she listened to him, read the mayor's letter, and she thought, without meaning to think it, that a man who left wages uncollected was either very foolish or very principled, and she was curious which. She found out he was both. Roscoe Kendrick appeared at her property for the first time on a Thursday morning in early April, on foot, which was unusual enough in the West to make her reach for the shotgun she kept beside the door. He came up the road from Redemption with a long, easy stride and his hat in his hand, which she took to mean he had been raised with some manners somewhere, and he stopped at the edge of her property, exactly at the boundary where the fence should have been but wasn't, and he called out in a voice that carried the particular resonance of a man accustomed to speaking across open ground. "Mrs. Holloway, my name is Roscoe Kendrick. I heard in town you might need a hired hand." She stepped onto the porch with the shotgun resting in the crook of her arm, not aimed but present. "Who told you that?" "Nobody told me," he said. "I looked at the property when I rode past yesterday and made an educated guess." Which was an interesting thing to say. Most men would have named a source. He was telling her, plainly and apparently without ego, that he had observed her situation and drawn a conclusion. She found herself irritated by this, partly because he was right and partly because she did not enjoy being assessed. "What was it about my property that told you I needed help?" she said. He pointed to the northeast corner of her land, where the boundary between her property and the open range was marked by nothing except a rusted wire that had been stapled to a post that was leaning at approximately 30 degrees from vertical. "That wire won't stop a determined jackrabbit," he said, "let alone cattle. You'll lose a third of your herd to the open range before summer if you don't put up something better." She looked at the wire. She had been looking at the wire for 6 months and telling herself she would get to it when she had time and funds, neither of which she had in abundance. The fact that this stranger had ridden past her property once and identified the most urgent problem in approximately 30 seconds was annoying in a way that felt uncomfortably like relief. "I haven't got much to pay," she said. "I haven't asked for much," he said. She hired him that day at a rate of 50 cents per day plus dinner, which was the honest maximum she could afford. He had agreed without negotiation, which should perhaps have told her something. The next 6 weeks were an education. Roscoe Kendrick worked the way that very few people work, which is to say he worked as though the work itself was the point rather than the compensation. He arrived before dawn every morning, always on foot from his room at the boarding house in town, and he worked until the light failed, and he did not waste words or movement. He rebuilt the northeast fence line first, as he had predicted was urgent, setting posts that were plumb and true in ways that Delia could see at a glance were superior to anything that had been done on her property before. He repaired the barn door so that it closed properly for the first time in the 3.5 years she had lived there. He fixed the chimney, which had been pulling smoke into the house at a slight angle that had given her headaches every winter, and that 3 different men in Redemption had told her was simply how old chimneys worked, which was apparently a lie. He did not offer opinions unless asked. He did not assume any authority over her decisions. When she told him to do something one way and he thought there was a better way, he said so plainly and gave his reason, and then did it however she decided. He was, in the most practical sense, exactly the kind of partner that Warren Holloway's letters had described, and Warren Holloway himself had never managed to be. She told herself this was a professional observation and had nothing to do with the way he looked in the morning light. It had a little to do with the way he looked in the morning light. He was 32 years old. She knew from the incidentally informative Mrs. Ruiz at the boarding house, who had a talent for knowing everyone's business within 48 hours of their arrival in Redemption. He was from Texas originally, from a place in the hill country near San Antonio, and he had been moving since his mid-20s, Not running, exactly, but searching, though for what Mrs. Ruiz could not specify. He had skills that pointed to a variety of occupations. He could carpenter and he could fix machinery, and he could manage cattle, and he could do the careful, detailed work of accounting that suggested some education. He had a calm that suggested either great self-possession or great practice at concealing turbulence, and Delia suspected it was both. The hidden motive question occurred to her around the end of the third week. She was not a woman who trusted easily, and she was aware that a man who worked this hard for 50 cents a day either had very unusual values or very specific reasons, and she had not yet been able to determine which applied to Roscoe Kendrick. One evening after dinner, when the habit of evening conversation on the porch had already established itself in a way that felt both natural and slightly alarming, she asked him directly. "Why are you here?" she said. He was looking out at the desert where the last light was doing the thing it did in April, turning the saguaros into dark, tall shapes against a sky the color of burning peaches. He did not pretend not to understand the question. "I was heading north," he said. "Heard there was work in the mining towns in Colorado. Stopped here because I needed to rest the horse, and I didn't leave because the work was interesting." "Interesting," she said. "You've built something real here," he said. "On your own. That's not common." He looked at her then, a direct look that she had learned was characteristic of him, the look of a man who said what he meant and meant what he said and did not see any particular advantage in indirection. "I respect real things. You're not going to Colorado." "Not right now," he said. Which was not the same thing as never, and she filed that information in the part of her mind that kept track of exits and contingencies, the part that had been very active since Warren died, and that she privately thought of as her sensible self. Her sensible self noted that Roscoe Kendrick had not committed to anything, that he was a drifting man who would eventually drift, that investing any emotional energy in his presence was a well-established route to a particular kind of pain. Her sensible self was, unfortunately, becoming somewhat difficult to hear over other parts of herself that were paying attention to entirely different things. It was during the 5th week that the situation in Redemption began to complicate matters in ways that had nothing to do with her personal confusion and everything to do with the darker realities of the West in 1882. The trouble had a name, and the name was Harlan Pruitt. Harlan Pruitt was the largest landowner in the Redemption Valley, a man who had been in Arizona Territory since before it was Arizona Territory, who had acquired his land through a combination of legal purchase, strategic marriage, and a flexibility about legal process that the people of Redemption had learned to accept because the alternative was conflict with a man who had 6 permanent hands and enough money to make legal trouble for anyone who annoyed him. He was not violent in the overt way of the dime novel villains, but he had a quality that Delia had always found more disturbing than open menace, which was the quality of absolute patience. Harlan Pruitt wanted things and he waited for them, and the waiting only made the wanting sharper and more focused. What Harlan Pruitt wanted, it had become clear over the past year, was Delia Holloway's quarter section of land. It was not a secret that her property sat at the junction of 2 waterways, a permanent stream called Cutter Creek and a seasonal one called the April Branch, and that whoever controlled that junction controlled a significant percentage of the reliable water in the valley's grazing land. Warren Holloway had known this and had held on to the land partly because of it. Delia knew it too, and she had spent her widowhood quietly improving her legal position, paying the county taxes 2 years in advance when she had a good season, making sure the deed records in Redemption were current and clear, doing all the things a woman who knew her property was coveted needed to do. Harlan Pruitt had approached her 3 times about selling, with offers that increased each time, and each time Delia had declined with the precise and pleasant courtesy of a woman who had made up her mind and did not require further discussion. His 4th approach came in the 4th week of Roscoe Kendrick's employment, and it was different from the others in a way that set the hairs on the back of her neck upright. He came himself, which he had done before, but this time he brought two of his hands with him, men named Cord and Dell, who were large and quiet in the specific way of men who were employed for reasons that went beyond cattle management. He sat across from her at her kitchen table, and he told her, with a smile that did not reach his eyes, that he was concerned about the legal clarity of her deed, that he had been doing some research, and there was a question about whether Warren Holloway's original claim had been properly filed, and that while he was certain it was nothing, these things could become expensive and inconvenient to resolve, and he would hate to see her burdened with that kind of uncertainty. It was a threat. It was the smoothest, most legally draped threat she had ever received, and she sat across from him and kept her face still and her hands folded, and she said that she appreciated his concern, and she would have her lawyer review the deed, and she thanked him for coming, and she walked him to the door, and when his horse and his two large quiet hands had ridden away, she went to the barn where Roscoe was repairing the hinge on the side door, and she told him what had happened. She had not meant to tell him. She had told herself the walk to the barn was about something else. But when she got there and she saw him working with the careful, focused attention he brought to everything, and the evening light coming through the gap in the boards making a stripe across his shoulder, she found herself talking before she had fully decided to. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he set down the hinge and turned to look at her with the dark, steady eyes that she had been trying very hard not to think about too much. "Is the deed clean?" he said. "Yes," she said. "Warren filed everything properly. I checked before I hired a lawyer in Tucson to review it last year. Everything is in order." "Then he's bluffing," Roscoe said. "He's hoping the threat of legal trouble is enough to push you into selling before you find out there's no actual threat." "That's what I think," she said. "But knowing he's bluffing and being able to prove it are different things. What does your lawyer in Tucson say?" "I haven't told him yet. I'd have to write and then wait for a reply, and the mail between here and Tucson takes anywhere from 5 days to 2 weeks depending on the stage schedule." She stopped. "I'm not sure why I'm telling you this." "Because you needed to tell someone," he said, without any smugness, just observation. "And you don't have anyone else in redemption you trust enough." The accuracy of this landed somewhere tender. She looked at him for a moment, this man she had known for 5 weeks, this stranger who had walked onto her property and built himself into her daily life with the same careful, plumb-true precision he brought to fences and barn doors and chimneys, and she thought that he was right, and that she had not noticed how isolated she had become until someone named the isolation. "Write your lawyer tonight," he said. "I'll ride to Redemption tomorrow and check the county deed records myself. I know how to read a land filing, and will know for certain what Prout actually has." "I can check the county records myself," she said. "I know you can," he said. "But if you go, Prout will know you went and he'll know his tactic worried you. If I go, he doesn't know what to make of it. It's less information for him." She thought about this and decided he was right. "Thank you," she said, and the words felt strange in her mouth, not because she was ungenerous, but because she had become so unaccustomed to having someone to thank. The county records confirmed what she had believed. The Holloway deed was properly filed and legally unassailable, registered in both the Redemption County records and the territorial records in Prescott. Harlan Prout had exactly nothing. Roscoe brought her a copy of the relevant record pages, written out in his careful hand, and she read them over dinner and felt the tension in her shoulders release by about half. "He'll try something else," she said. "Probably," Roscoe agreed. "You don't seem particularly worried about that." He looked up from his plate. "I'm not worried about it," he said. "I'm thinking about it. There's a difference." This was the first evening that the conversation on the porch afterward extended past full dark. They talked about Prout and tactics, and then the tactics became less urgent, and the conversation became other things. The kind of other things that happen when two people who are both accustomed to keeping their own counsel find themselves in the company of someone who actually listens. She told him about St. Louis, about her father's store, about reading Warren's letters and believing in them completely. She told him this without self-pity, just as information, as context. He listened with the full attention that she had noticed he gave to everything, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment before he spoke. "That must have been a particular kind of hard," he said. "Believing in something completely and finding out the thing itself wasn't equal to what you believed." "Yes," she said, "that's exactly what it was." "I've had something like that," he said. She waited. He looked out at the dark desert for a while before he said, "I had a partner in a ranch in Texas. We'd been building it for 3 years. Land, stock, equipment. We both put everything we had into it." He paused. "I found out he'd been signing my name to documents for 2 years. Borrowed against the land in my name without telling me. When the bank called the debt, the ranch was gone and he was already in Mexico." "What happened to him?" she said. "I don't know," he said. "I didn't go after him." "Why not?" He turned to look at her, and there was something in his face that was the quiet residue of an old decision. "Because going after him would have been about anger, and anger would have put me somewhere I didn't want to be. And the ranch was gone regardless of what I did. So I started over." He paused. "That's when I started moving." She understood then, in a way that went past words, what it was that Roscoe Kendrick was looking for. Not a place exactly, though he had framed it as heading north, heading somewhere. He was looking for the thing that had been taken from him without his knowledge, which was not the ranch or the money, but the ability to build something with trust as the foundation. He was looking for ground that was solid. And she, who had spent 2 years proving to herself that she could stand alone, found the idea of solid ground deeply, dangerously appealing. The next morning he arrived before dawn as usual, and she came out to find him already working on the section of fence along the western boundary. And she stood in the cool April morning and watched him work for a moment before she went to the garden, and she thought that this was becoming a very complicated situation. The complication deepened 3 weeks later when the fence at the eastern boundary disappeared. Not the fence Roscoe had repaired at the northeast corner. A section of the original fence along the eastern edge of the property, where her land bordered the open range. A stretch of about 40 yards that she found lying flat in the dust one morning, the posts pulled clean out of the ground with a thoroughness that was not the work of cattle or weather. Delia stood looking at the collapsed fence with her hands on her hips and the particular cold clarity that danger brought, and she knew immediately that this was Harlan Pruitt, that having failed with legal threats he was moving to a different kind of pressure. When cattle from the open range moved through a gap in a fence onto claimed land and damaged crops or water sources, the legal and practical remedy was complicated and slow. If the gap stayed open long enough, and if cattle used the land long enough, a determined man with a good lawyer could make a claim of usage that muddied the legal picture considerably. It was a slow play, a patient play, exactly the kind of play that a man with Harlan Pruitt's temperament would make. She rode to redemption, and she told the county sheriff, a man named Aldous Webb who was reasonably honest but also reasonably cautious about making enemies of the Pruitt family. He came out, looked at the flattened fence, wrote a report that noted the damage without naming any suspects, and told her he would look into it, which they both knew was a phrase that in this context meant very little. Roscoe had the fence rebuilt within 2 days. 3 days after that, a section at the southeast corner was down. Then a week later, a section at the northwest. Each time, the posts were pulled, not broken, pulled out of the ground deliberately and carefully, which was too much work for a casual act of mischief and too specific in its location to be accidental. Delia began to understand that Pruitt was not just trying to let cattle through. He was trying to exhaust her, to wear down her resources and her will with the cost of constant repair, to make the property feel less like something worth holding and more like a liability. She sat on the porch the evening after the northwest repair was completed, and she thought about this with the methodical precision that difficult problems required, and she said to Roscoe, who was sitting in the other chair in the way that had become comfortable and familiar in a way she no longer pretended was purely professional, "He's going to keep doing this until I either sell or until the cost of the repairs breaks me. Yes, Roscoe said. So the answer is either to find a way to stop him or to make the repairs so permanent and so thorough that the cost and effort of pulling them out exceeds whatever he's getting from the harassment. Roscoe was quiet for a moment. Or both, he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the stars, which in Arizona territory in 1882 were abundant enough to seem like a kind of extravagance, and she could see the thinking happening behind his eyes. "Tell me the or both," she said. He turned to look at her. "The county can't or won't act. Prout knows that, but there are other pressures. He's not the only large landowner in the valley. There are 2 or 3 others who have their own reasons to be concerned about a man who plays games with water rights and property boundaries, because if it works on you, they know they might be next. If you talk to them, if you made the case that Prout is a general threat rather than just your particular problem, you might find some support. And the repairs. I can build a fence," he said. "That would be more trouble to pull out than it would be worth. Stone foundation posts, deep set, properly mortared. It would take half the night and equipment they'd have to borrow to pull them without breaking them." She thought about the money this would require, the stone, the mortar, the labor. She thought about her accounts, which were stable but not comfortable, and she thought about the $200 she had saved against exactly this kind of emergency. "Do it," she said. The next 3 weeks were the most intense period she had experienced since Warren's death, though intense in a completely different way. Roscoe sourced the stone from a quarry north of Redemption, negotiating the price himself with a skill that she observed with interest, and he began the slow, demanding work of setting the corner and gate posts in stone and mortar, while she rode out to the neighboring properties. She visited each of the large landowners in the valley, a man named Thomas Garver who ran sheep on the east side, and a family named Morales who had been in the valley since before the American claim and whose patriarch Don Eduardo Morales had a memory for injustice that was both sharp and patient, and she made her case. The conversations were different with each of them. With Thomas Garver, she spoke the language of legal precedent and property rights, which interested him because he was a methodical man. With Don Eduardo Morales, she spoke more carefully, with a respect for what his family had navigated across decades and government changes, and she acknowledged plainly that her own legal security was a privilege that had not always been equally distributed in the valley, and that she was asking for solidarity in a situation that was in some ways a smaller version of pressures that the Morales family had faced in much larger forms. Don Eduardo listened to her with serious dark eyes, and then said, in his carefully precise English, that he would write a letter to the county territorial office that would make the pattern of fence interference very clear, and that his son Miguel would be glad to be a witness if it came to that. By the end of those 3 weeks, she had 3 neighbors who were actively documenting Prout's behavior, and one who had written directly to the territorial governor's office, and Roscoe had completed the southeast corner posts in stone and was halfway through the northwest. The fence interference stopped. Not immediately, not dramatically, but it stopped, and after another month had passed without incident, she allowed herself to believe that the combination of the stone posts and the neighborly pressure had made the harassment too costly and too public for Prout to continue. She was aware, in a part of herself that she kept carefully separate from the relief, that Roscoe Kendrick had been essential to this. Not because she could not have done any of it herself, but because having someone to think alongside, having someone who worked at the problem with the same steady intelligence she brought to it, and who also happened to be able to haul 50-pound stones into alignment, had made the difference between a situation that was barely survivable and one that was survivable with enough energy left over to actually win. And then one evening in early July, sitting on the porch in the dusk with the heat still radiating up from the red earth, she became aware that she had stopped thinking about whether she could do things without him and had started simply, automatically, as though it was already true, thinking about them as a unit that did things together. This alarmed her considerably. She stood up abruptly and said she had things to do inside, and she went inside, and she stood in her kitchen in the dark again, which was becoming a habit, and she had the same conversation with herself that she had been having in various forms for 2 months, which went approximately. This is a hired hand, this is a working arrangement. He said himself he was heading north. This is a man with a dark past and a habit of moving. He has said nothing. He has done nothing. You are confusing reliable good work for something it is not. And then a second, quieter voice said, "You have been alone for 2 years, and for 2 years you have been sufficient, and you were right to discover that about yourself. And none of that changes if you also admit that when he says good morning, the day is better than when he doesn't." She did not sleep well that night. The following morning she came out to find him already at the northwest corner, working on the final stone posts, and she brought him coffee as she did every morning, and she handed it to him, and he took it, and he looked at her with the steady dark eyes that saw too much, and he said, "You're thinking about something that bothers you." "I'm thinking about several things," she said. "Which one is bothering you most?" She looked at him for a long moment. The morning light was doing things again. She set her jaw in the way her father had called stubborn and said, "You said you were heading north." He set the coffee down on the flat top of the nearest stone post, and he turned to face her fully, which was, she had learned, something he did when he considered a conversation important. He gave her his full attention the way other people gave speeches. "I said I was heading north when I arrived," he said. "That was April. It's July." "Yes," he said, "it is. What does that mean?" "It means," he said slowly, carefully, like a man choosing each word for its load-bearing capacity, "that I found something worth staying for." The silence that followed was the kind she had come to recognize as the frontier between two different possible futures. She felt her heart doing something large and inconvenient in her chest, and she thought about Warren's letters and the gap between what people said and what they meant. And she thought about the fence posts in stone and mortar, and the careful rebuilding of every broken thing on her property. And she thought that there was a difference between letters written to attract and work done, because the work itself was the statement. "Roscoe," she said. "Delia," he said, which was the first time either of them had used the other's first name without the formal prefix, and they both seemed to notice this at the same moment, and something shifted in the air between them like the barometric change before summer rain. "I don't know what I'm doing," she said, with the honesty that she valued more than dignity. "Neither do I," he said. "I know what I want. I'm not sure of the right way to go about it." "What do you want?" He looked at her property, at the stone posts and the neat fence line and the garden that was doing considerably better since he had helped her identify which sections needed more water and adjusted the irrigation ditch. And then he looked at her, and he said, "I told you last night. Everything." She had not been expecting him to refer to the night before, to the words he had said after building the fence she had not asked for, the word that had sent her inside with her heart hammering. She had thought somehow that they had both tacitly agreed to let that moment rest for a while. "That's a large word," she said. "Yes," he said, "it is." She looked at him for a long time. She thought about trust, which she had built very carefully into her own private architecture after Warren, using the slow, reliable materials of observation and time. She thought about what she actually knew about Roscoe Kendrick. He worked without cutting corners. He was honest to a degree that was sometimes uncomfortable. He had left wages uncollected because the manner of his leaving had made collecting them feel wrong to him. He had spent 3 months rebuilding her land, and had asked for no more than what they had agreed. He had thought alongside her about Prout without trying to take the problem from her. He had treated her intelligence as a given rather than a surprise. She thought about these things with the methodical care of a woman who had learned not to let feeling outrun evidence, and she found to her surprise that the evidence was substantial. "I need time," she said. "I have time," he said. She believed him. Not because of the words, but because of the way he then picked up his coffee and turned back to the stone post he was setting, not wounded or pressuring or performing patience, simply continuing to work with the same attention he always brought, as though what he had said was true and required no further demonstration. She went back to the house. She stood at the kitchen window and watched him work, and she let herself, for the first time, feel the full weight of what she felt without immediately constructing reasons against it, and it was significant. It was, she thought, more significant than she had been prepared to admit. The time she asked for took approximately 10 days. On the 11th day, which was a Wednesday in mid-July with a heat that turned the air above the desert floor into something visible and wavering, she went out to where he was working on the last section of the western fence line, and she said, without preamble, because she had decided that anything that needed preamble was probably a smaller thing than what she was actually saying, "I think you should stay." He looked up. His face did not break into an easy grin. He looked at her with the serious, attentive look that she valued precisely because it could not be faked, and he said, "I intend to." "Permanently," she said, wanting to be clear. "Yes," he said, "that's what I mean." She nodded. She could feel that her face was doing something she could not entirely control, something warm and helpless that she suspected was readable and did not currently care. "All right then," she said. "All right," he said. And then he smiled, and it was the first time she had seen him smile with his whole face rather than just the small controlled version he usually allowed, and it was something that she was going to need a moment to recover from. She turned and walked back to the house, and when she was inside she sat down in the kitchen chair, and she pressed her hands flat on the table, and she thought, with enormous and slightly terrifying clarity, that she was in love with Roscoe Kendrick, and that this was no longer alarming. It was, instead, the most settled she had felt since she had first set foot on this red earth and decided it was hers. What followed was a period of days that Delia would later think of as the first time she had fully inhabited her own life. She and Roscoe moved through the work of the property with a new quality of understanding between them, the kind that is not sentimentally soft but practically warm, the kind that means someone knows how you take your coffee and which accounts you check first in the morning, and when you need to think in silence, and when you need someone to think alongside. They talked in the evenings on the porch, and the conversations ranged across years and distances and ideas, and she discovered that his mind was both precise and genuinely curious, that he had read widely despite his years of physical labor, that he had opinions about history and agriculture, and the ongoing injustices of the territorial land policies that were thoughtful and not simple. They talked about the ways in which the territory's legal structures had been built to favor certain people and disadvantage others, about the Morales family's experience of watching land that had been theirs for generations become suddenly subject to legal frameworks designed by and for people who had arrived much later. Roscoe spoke about this with the particular seriousness of a man who had himself been defrauded and who understood, at a practical level, how legal systems could be made to serve the powerful against the honest. And Delia listened and thought about her own position, a widow with clear title who had benefited from legal systems that had not been equally available to her neighbors, and she thought about fairness in the larger sense, not just for herself. One evening she told him she wanted to invite the Morales family to dinner. He looked at her, and she could see him thinking through this, not the social calculation, but something more serious, and then he said, "Yes, I think that's right." The dinner was a quiet and genuinely warm event. Don Eduardo Morales came with his wife Maria and their son Miguel, who was 25 and had his father's serious eyes and a slightly sharper sense of humor, and they sat around Delia's table and ate and talked. And Delia felt the particular satisfaction of a good act done simply, without performance, just because it was the right extension of gratitude and respect. It was Miguel Morales on the way out that evening who said quietly to Roscoe, "You should marry her. Any man can see you should marry her." Roscoe, standing in the doorway with the lamplight behind him, said, "I'm aware of that." Delia, who was in the kitchen and heard this through the open window, felt her heart do the large inconvenient thing again, and stood very still with a dish towel in her hands until she heard Miguel's horse moving away. She put down the dish towel and she walked out onto the porch, and Roscoe was still there, standing in the dark with his back to the door, looking at the stars in the Arizona sky, and she stood beside him for a moment, and then she said, "Were you ever going to ask me?" He turned to look at her. In the dark she could see the line of his jaw and the darkness of his eyes, and the way his shoulders carried the question without any evasion. "I was working up to it," he said. "I didn't want to rush. You have been building me a house piece by piece," she said. "One fence post at a time, one repaired hinge, one chimney. I think the not rushing may have been extended to the point of excessive caution." He looked at her for a moment, and then the slow smile happened again, the one that did the thing to her that she had stopped pretending did not happen. He reached out and took her hand, which was the first time they had touched with intention, and it was quiet and warm and certain in the same way that his fence posts were plumb and true. "Delia Holloway," he said, and the way he said her name was different from how anyone else had ever said it, as though it was the name of something he already considered precious. "Will you do me the honor of marrying me?" She looked at him. She thought about letters and promises and the gap between them and what they meant. She thought about stone foundation posts and chimneys that pulled the smoke in the right direction and fences that no one could pull down without effort that exceeded their purpose. She thought about evenings on the porch and honest conversation and a man who said everything and meant it. "Yes," she said, "I will." He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles in a gesture that was old-fashioned and serious and entirely characteristic of him, and she thought that she was not afraid, and that the absence of fear was itself remarkable. They were married in redemption in August of 1882 by the circuit preacher who came through every 6 weeks, in a ceremony that was small and genuinely felt. Mrs. Ruiz from the boarding house came, and Thomas Garver and his wife, and the Morales family in full, and Pete Dawson from the livery, who could not have been kept away from any event of note in redemption without considerable physical force. Delia wore her best dress, which was dark blue wool that was slightly too warm for August in Arizona, but which was the best she had, and Roscoe wore a clean white shirt and dark trousers and had shaved. And when she walked toward him and saw his face, she felt everything she had decided to feel, deep and clear, and without reservation. The preacher asked the questions and they answered them, and Roscoe put a ring on her finger that she had not seen before, a simple gold band that had clearly been purchased and carried in his pocket for some time prior to her answer on the porch, which told her something about the nature of his patience that she found very moving. When the preacher said they were married, Roscoe kissed her, properly and without embarrassment, in front of Mrs. Ruiz and the Morales family and Pete Dawson, and she kissed him back, and Miguel Morales said something in Spanish that made his father try not to smile. The months after the wedding were a revelation of a specific kind, which was the revelation of what it feels like to choose correctly and to know it. They ran the property together in the full partnership that Warren's letters had promised, and Warren himself had never delivered, with Roscoe's particular genius for construction and repair and Delia's precision with the accounts and her sharp sense of the market, and the two of them together making decisions that neither would have made quite as well alone. The property improved visibly through the fall and winter of 1882 into 1883. The barn was fully repaired and expanded to hold 6 more cattle. A proper root cellar was dug, which transformed their food storage situation through the winter. Roscoe built a second room onto the house, planning ahead in ways that he did not make explicit, but that Delia understood perfectly, and the understanding of what he was planning for made her feel something so large and warm that she had to be outside for a while to contain it. Harlan Prout made one more attempt, in October of 1882, though this one was purely financial. A third party representing an anonymous buyer who offered a sum that would have been extremely difficult to refuse 2 years ago. Delia declined, in writing, with Roscoe's name on the document alongside hers, which was the new legal reality of their situation, and she wrote additionally to the county recorder to note the attempt and its context, as part of the ongoing record she was building. Prute did not approach again. The first winter of their marriage was cold and close and full of the kind of specific happiness that grows in enclosed spaces when the two people sharing them are fundamentally glad to be there. They read in the evenings by lamplight, both of them, from the same small library of books she had brought from St. Louis, and the few he had accumulated in his years of moving. They talked about everything, in the way they had been talking since April on the porch, but with the new warmth of certainty beneath it, the warmth of knowing this was not temporary. He told her more about Texas, about the ranch he had built and lost, and she could hear in the way he spoke about it not the raw wound it had been when she first heard the story, but something processed into a kind of useful scar tissue, something that had taught him what he valued and why. He told her about his father, who had been a craftsman, a man who built furniture in the hill country, and had taught Roscoe that the difference between a good piece of work and a great one was the care given to the parts that no one would see, the joints under the surface, the bracing in the back. He said his father had told him that hidden work was a test of character, because if you cut corners where no one was looking, it told you something about yourself. That's why you went back to set the fence posts in stone even after Prute stopped, she said one evening. You would have done it anyway. Yes, he said, eventually, because of your father. Because I don't know how to do things partially, he said. I either do them or I don't. She thought about the word everything, the single word he had said on the first evening, and she understood now that it was not a romantic flourish. It was a literal statement about his character. He had told her exactly what he was offering, and he had meant every letter of it. In the spring of 1883, Delia discovered she was pregnant. She told him one morning in March, matter-of-factly, sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee. She told him the way she told him most things, directly, without performance, watching his face for the honest reaction rather than the managed one. His face, for the first time in her experience of him, showed something that looked like being momentarily overwhelmed. Not badly, not with anything like alarm or withdrawal. The opposite. He looked at her across the table, and there was something in his eyes that was the emotional equivalent of a man who has been working toward a place for a very long time and has just arrived, and she felt it move through her in a wave. He got up from the table and he came around to where she was sitting, and he crouched down beside her chair, and he took both her hands in his, and he looked at her with the full serious attention he gave to important things, and he said, "Are you well? Are you frightened?" "I'm well," she said. "I'm not frightened." "Good," he said. "Neither am I." And then, quietly, with a conviction that she felt in the bones of her hands where he was holding them, he said, "We're going to be fine, all three of us." She believed him, not with the credulous hope of the woman who had read Warren's letters 17 times and projected a full future onto carefully chosen words. She believed him with the earned and evidence-based certainty of a woman who had watched the same man for nearly a year in the particular conditions that strip pretense away. The conditions of daily work and physical difficulty, and real danger and genuine problem-solving, and had found him consistently to be what he said he was. She leaned forward and pressed her forehead against his, and they stayed like that in the morning light in their kitchen, in the house he had been building room by room and post by post, and she thought that she had never in her life been more exactly where she wanted to be. The pregnancy changed the rhythm of the property work in ways that Roscoe managed with characteristic attention. He took on more of the physically heavy work without comment or ceremony, simply shifting the distribution without drawing attention to the shift, which she noticed and appreciated in equal measure. He was not protective in a way that made her feel diminished. He was protective in the way that someone is protective of something they love, which is to say he was thoughtful and present and paid attention, but he did not restrict or override. She continued the accounts and the correspondence and road to redemption until well into the summer, at which point writing became less comfortable, and she transitioned to letting Roscoe make the supply runs while she managed the property from home, which suited her in a way she had not expected, the particular satisfaction of having someone trustworthy to send. The house was fully finished by June. Roscoe had added the second room in the fall, and in the spring he had begun work on a proper covered porch on the south side, facing the desert view that she had always found most beautiful in the late afternoon, and he finished it in May so that she had somewhere comfortable to sit in the shade and work on the accounts through the increasingly warm days. He had made the porch railing with the same careful joinery his father had taught him, the mortise and tenon joints hidden beneath a smooth surface, the kind of work that was made for its own integrity rather than for display. And she ran her hands along it one afternoon and felt the solidity of it and thought about how you could know a person through what they built. The baby came in November of 1883, on a Tuesday, in the bedroom of the house that Roscoe had built, attended by the doctor from Redemption and Mrs. Ruiz, who had appointed herself indispensable to the occasion without being formally invited, and was in fact enormously useful. It was a boy, strong and loud, with Roscoe's dark hair and Delia's stubborn chin, and they named him Thomas James Kendrick, Thomas for Thomas Garver, who had been unexpectedly kind to them, and James for Roscoe's father. When the doctor and Mrs. Ruiz had gone and the house was quiet, and the baby was asleep in the cradle that Roscoe had built in September from the same careful joining as the porch railing, Delia lay in their bed and watched her husband hold their son for the first time in the lamplight, and she felt something so precise and complete that it required no name. It simply was. The way the land was, the way the sky was, the way the stone posts stood in the red earth around the perimeter of everything they had built together. Roscoe looked up from the baby and he found her watching him, and his face in the lamplight was the face of a man who had found the solid ground he had been looking for, and she thought that she had too. "What are you thinking?" he said, quietly, so as not to wake Thomas. "I'm thinking," she said, "that everything you promised is exactly what you delivered." "I'm not done," he said. She smiled. "What's left?" He looked around the room, at the solid walls and the good window framing and the cradle of proper joinery, and then at her with the same comprehensive look he had given to her property on that evening in July, inventorying what was there and what was possible and what he had in mind. "We need more fence on the north side," he said. "The root cellar extension, better irrigation on the upper field, a smokehouse." He paused. "Another room, eventually." "Another room," she said. "Eventually," he said again, with a small smile, and she understood what eventually meant, and she thought that Roscoe Kendrick's eventually was one of her favorite words in any language. Thomas James Kendrick grew into a toddler in the years that followed, sturdy and determined, walking before most children in Redemption did, and communicating his opinions through an impressive combination of words and pointed gestures, which everyone said was entirely his mother, though Delia noted privately that the determination to finish what he started was entirely his father. The property continued to grow. The north fence went up in the spring of 1884. The root cellar extension was complete by summer. Roscoe built the smokehouse in the fall, and it was better than the one at the Garver place, which Thomas Garver admitted with the particular graciousness of a man who is genuinely impressed, and the Garver wife asked Roscoe if he would build one for them as well, for which he quoted a fair price, and completed the work in winter when their own property was quiet. It became known in the Redemption Valley that if something needed to be built properly, Roscoe Kendrick was the man, and in the quieter months he began taking on building work for neighbors and occasionally for the town itself. The church needed a new floor, the schoolhouse needed new windows properly fitted, the sheriff's office needed a door that actually locked, each project done with the same joinery-deep precision. Each one adding to a reputation and a small additional income that they saved carefully against the future, they could both see taking shape. Delia expanded the garden significantly in 1884, introducing a systematic crop rotation that she had been thinking about for 2 years and had finally planned with the careful logic she brought to accounts. And the yields improved to the point where they had surplus to sell in redemption, modest surplus but real, and it contributed to a financial stability that she found deeply satisfying in ways that went beyond money, the satisfaction of something built correctly showing its returns. In the spring of 1885, with Thomas nearly 18 months old and moving through the house at a pace that required constant peripheral attention, Delia told Roscoe she was expecting again. This time he was not momentarily overwhelmed. This time he put down the tool he was holding and he looked at her with the warm, steady eyes and he said, "Good. Just that. Good," with such complete and unqualified gladness that it was almost more affecting than the more elaborate response had been. The second baby arrived in November of 1885. A girl this time, smaller than Thomas had been but with exactly the same dark hair and the same refusal to sleep at normal hours, and they named her Cora Me Kendrick, me for Delia's mother back in St. Louis, who had been writing increasingly wistful letters about grandchildren, and who received a full account of Cora's arrival with a daguerreotype taken by the man in redemption who had recently acquired a camera. Thomas took his sister's arrival with the philosophical resignation of a small child who has been prepared for something and has decided to accept it, and within 2 weeks had developed a proprietary affection for her that expressed itself mainly in standing near her cradle and informing adults that the baby was sleeping, in the tone of a person who finds this information deeply important. Roscoe built a second cradle for Cora with a small modification, a slight rocker adjustment that he had calculated from observing what soothed Thomas and refining it, and it worked on Cora even more effectively, and Delia watched him figure this out with systematic and affectionate attention, and thought that he approached parenthood the same way he approached carpentry, with genuine curiosity about how the thing worked, and a commitment to doing it right at the level that didn't show. The winter of 1885 was a quiet and full winter, the fullest in Delia's memory, the house now carrying the sounds of 2 children and 2 adults, and the work and the reading and the conversation, and the lamplight evenings that had been the best part of her life since the porch evenings of that first summer, amplified now into something richer. She wrote to her mother and described her life, and she could feel, in the writing, the difficulty of conveying to someone in St. Louis what a quarter section of land in Arizona territory actually was, what it felt like to have built something real in a place that was vast and demanding and beautiful in ways that did not reduce to words easily. She tried anyway. She said, "The sunsets here are still the impossible kind every evening." She said, "The children are well. Thomas has decided he is in charge of the farm and conducts inspections of the fence line in a manner I recognize from his father." She said, "I am happy, in a way that is not dramatic or surprising any longer but has become the quality of the air I breathe, which is perhaps the best kind of happiness." Her mother wrote back with warmth and a gentle suggestion that St. Louis was not so far, and Delia smiled at the letter and wrote back that she would bring the family east in the summer, a promise she intended to keep. Harlan Prout died in the spring of 1886, not violently, not from any dramatic confrontation, but from a stroke, which the doctor in Redemption said was consistent with a man of his age and temperament. His land went to his son, a man named Gerald Prout who had none of his father's patience and considerably less of his strategic intelligence, and who within a year had sold off 2/3 of the water rights in a series of decisions that struck the valley's landowners as puzzling, and that Don Eduardo Morales described, when he and Delia discussed it over coffee at his kitchen table, as the difference between a man who builds power carefully over decades and the man who inherits it and does not understand its construction. Gerald Prout sold the land east of Cutter Creek to an Eastern investment group in 1887, and the Kendrick property, sitting at its water junction, suddenly became more rather than less valuable, because the investment group needed the water access that only Delia and Roscoe's land provided, and they came with a very different proposal than Harlan Prut's had ever been. A lease agreement for water rights that was legally precise and financially significant, and that Delia negotiated herself, in 2 meetings in redemption with the group's representative, emerging with terms that the representative's own lawyer described as favorable to the landowner. Roscoe had not attended the negotiations. He had been at the property with the children, and when she came home the second day with the agreement in her hand, she told him the terms, and he looked at the document for a long time and then looked at her with an expression she recognized as the one he wore when he was genuinely impressed and was deciding how to say so without it being condescending, and he said, "That's a very good agreement." "Yes," she said. "It is." He smiled. "I know," he said. "I just said so." She laughed. It was one of the pure, spontaneous laughs that had become a regular feature of her life in ways she had not anticipated, the kind that came from genuine delight rather than social obligation, and she felt it in her whole body, and she thought again, as she often did, that this was exactly where she was supposed to be. The lease income from the water rights changed the texture of their financial life from stable to comfortable, and comfortable from a starting point of genuine self-sufficiency felt like abundance. They expanded the cattle herd. They improved the irrigation on the upper field. They put proper wooden floors in both bedrooms, replacing the packed earth that Delia had long since accepted as simply how things were, and that she had not let herself miss until the floors were there, and she stood on them in her bare feet in the morning, and felt the warmth of good wood, and thought that this was also a kind of luxury she had not asked for, and that was entirely characteristic of Roscoe Kendrick to provide. They made the trip to St. Louis in the summer of 1887, as she had promised. It was Thomas's 3rd year and Cora's 2nd, and the train journey was an education in what a 3-year-old and an almost 2-year-old do in a confined space over 2 days, which is roughly everything that confined spaces are not designed for. Roscoe managed this with the same composure he brought to all difficult projects, which is to say with patience and attention, and the occasional inspired distraction, and they arrived in St. Louis only somewhat frayed. Her mother wept when she saw the children. Her father shook Roscoe's hand for a long time with both hands, the way her father shook the hands of people he approved of, and said, "I've been reading your wife's letters for 5 years, and I'm glad to finally put a face to them." Roscoe said, "She writes truthfully." Her father said, "That she does." Delia stood in her parents' parlor in St. Louis with Thomas pulling at her skirt and Cora on her hip and Roscoe across the room talking to her father about Arizona land and irrigation, and whatever men talked about when they approved of each other. And she looked at the room she had grown up in, the familiar wallpaper and the clock on the mantel that had always been 5 minutes fast, and she felt the particular clarity of a person who has returned home and confirmed, without any sorrow, that home is now somewhere else. She looked at Roscoe, who chose that moment to look back at her, and the look that passed between them was the kind that does not need words and does not want them, the kind that carries everything. They stayed 10 days. They left with her mother's preserves and her father's handshake for Roscoe a second time, and the strong impression that both her parents felt better for having seen what they had seen, and the train back to Arizona carried Delia with a settled feeling of completeness, as though a last remaining loose thread had been tied off. Back in redemption, life continued in the best possible way, which is to say it continued to hold things worth continuing for. Thomas started attending the schoolhouse in Redemption in 1888, which he approached with the same investigative determination he brought to the farm and the fence line, coming home full of information about reading and numbers and the geography of states and territories, and wanting to know if they could go to all the places on the map. Roscoe spread a map of the territories on the kitchen table one evening, and walked Thomas through it with complete seriousness, pointing out the mountain ranges and the rivers and the distances. And Delia sat across the table and watched her husband and her son with their dark heads bent over the map, and felt something so warm and specific that it was almost painful. Cora, at 3, was considerably less interested in geography and considerably more interested in the mechanics of the farm, particularly the chickens, which she had identified as being under her personal management at an age when most children were still learning to navigate stairs. She named all 12 of them with names that made Roscoe work hard not to laugh, and she was inconsolable for 2 days when one named Professor died of natural causes in the winter of 1888. The third pregnancy came in 1889 when Thomas was 5 and Cora was 3, and this time Roscoe simply looked at her across the breakfast table and said, "When?" "September," she said. He nodded. He picked up his coffee. Then he set it down and said, "We need a bigger house." "We're fine," she said. "We will need a bigger house," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the house with the builder's eye, the eye that saw not what was there but what could be, and she thought that she had spent 9 years watching him do this, and it still had the power to move her. "All right," she said. "A bigger house." The addition went up over the summer of 1889, a proper expansion that added a room off the east side, and a larger kitchen that Delia had privately been wanting for 3 years without mentioning it, which told her something about how well he paid attention, that he had included the kitchen expansion without her having said a word, because he had been watching what she actually needed rather than waiting to be told. The baby arrived in September, another boy, born fast and loud, and with Delia's red hair, which appeared on a Kendrick child for the first time and delighted Roscoe in a specific way that she found immensely charming. They named him Samuel Roscoe Kendrick, Samuel for Delia's father's middle name and Roscoe because Delia had decided without any difficulty that it was a name worth passing on. When Roscoe held Samuel for the first time and looked at the red hair, he said, "I didn't expect that." "It surprises some people," Delia said from the bed. "My father says our family is stubborn enough to leave marks." Roscoe laughed, the real laugh, and she thought that of all the things she had built in Arizona territory, the sound of his laugh was the one she was proudest of. The 1880s turned into the 1890s with the particular momentum of a life that is working correctly, each year adding something to the structure without taking anything essential away. Thomas, at 6, was already helping with morning chores with the careful thoroughness of a child who has absorbed his father's approach to work. Cora, at 4, was managing the chickens and had moved on to having opinions about the vegetable garden that were, Delia noted with a private smile, not wrong. Samuel grew with the uncomplicated enthusiasm of a third child who is thoroughly loved and has never known anything different. Don Eduardo Morales died in the winter of 1891, peacefully, and in his own bed, which his son Miguel said was the right ending for a man who had fought long enough for everything. The Kendricks attended the funeral, all 5 of them, and Delia stood at the grave in the cold winter light and thought about the man who had written a letter to the territorial office, because she had asked for help with a problem, who had extended solidarity across a gap of different histories and different losses, and she thought that fairness was a small and inadequate word for what he had done and what his family had been. Miguel Morales, who was now 33 and running the Morales property with the same serious intelligence as his father, had become a genuine friend over the years, someone who came to dinner regularly and who Roscoe played chess with on winter evenings, losing more often than he won, which he accepted with equanimity. He was, Delia thought, still unmarried and still looking for something, and she hoped quietly that he would find it. He did in the spring of 1892, in the form of a woman named Consuela who came from Tucson to visit her cousins in Redemption, and who had, in Delia's observation, the particular combination of intelligence and directness that tended to cut through Miguel's habitual reserve in about 48 hours. They married in the summer, and Delia and Roscoe were at the wedding. And Delia thought that the valley's community was becoming something genuinely interwoven. People from different origins and different histories building something together that was more than any of them had been separately. The fence line around the Kendrick property by 1892 was one of the most solid boundary markers in the Redemption Valley, the result of 10 years of careful maintenance and regular improvement. The stone foundation posts that Roscoe had set in 1882 still perfectly plumb and solid, the wire and wood between them replaced and upgraded seasonally, the whole perimeter a testament to the principle that hidden work was the test of character. People in Redemption who asked Roscoe about fences, and increasingly people did, got the same answer. The foundation was the investment. If the foundation was right, the rest was maintenance. Delia had heard him say this many times in many variations, and she thought it was true about fences and about most other things worth having. In the summer of 1893, Roscoe's younger brother came to visit from Texas. His name was James Kendrick, the same James for whom Thomas had been partly named, and he was 28 and rangy and had Roscoe's dark eyes without the deep stillness, more surface animation, quicker to laugh and quicker to worry. He had heard about the Arizona property through their intermittent correspondence and had ridden up from San Antonio to see it, arriving on a Thursday afternoon unannounced, which Roscoe handled with a complete absence of surprise that suggested he had been expecting exactly this at some unspecified point. James Kendrick spent 2 weeks at the property, and spent most of it looking at everything Roscoe had built with an expression that Delia identified as the specific complex emotion of someone who loves a person and has missed them longer than they have fully admitted. On his last evening, sitting on the south porch in the late light, James said to his brother, "You found what you were looking for." "Yes," Roscoe said. "I can see it," James said. "The whole place looks like you." Delia, who was inside and could hear through the porch window she had learned to leave open, put her hand over her mouth for a moment. "How's San Antonio?" Roscoe said. "Smaller than I remembered," James said. "Might be room for another person in Redemption," Roscoe said. "The town's been growing. They're building a proper hotel." James stayed in Redemption for 6 months, then a year, and then quietly put down roots in the way that the Kendrick men apparently did, gradually and then completely. He found work as a carpenter, which he had learned in the same Texas Hill Country tradition as his brother, and he was good at it. And by 1895 he had a small property east of town and had begun building on it with the same methodical care. The Kendrick property in 1895 was a different kind of place from the quarter section, with the rusted wire fence that Roscoe had ridden past in 1882. The house was substantial now, properly built and well-maintained, the extended kitchen and the second addition making it large enough for 5 people to live in with comfort and without collision. The barn was solid and dry and housed 20 cattle. The garden was productive enough to supply the household through the winter and sell surplus in Redemption through the growing season. The fences were, as everyone in the valley acknowledged, excellent. Delia was 42 years old in 1895, and she was, she knew, the thing she had been working toward being for 20 years, which was a person who was fully and specifically herself in the world. She ran the accounts and the market dealings with the accumulated precision of 13 years of practice. She was known in Redemption as someone whose word was unambiguously good and whose opinion on practical matters was worth seeking. She served on the school board, had served since 1888, and had been central to the decision to hire a teacher with genuine qualifications who had come west from Ohio, and who had transformed the quality of the schoolhouse's instruction in ways that Thomas, now 11, benefited from enormously. Roscoe was 45, still lean and strong in the way of men who have never stopped working, still with the dark eyes and the stillness and the small controlled smile that broke sometimes into the full smile that she never took for granted. He had become something in the valley over the 13 years, not famous or public in any grand sense, but known in the solid foundational way of someone whose work was always honest and whose presence was always reliable. Men came to him with building questions and got answers that were direct and accurate. He built the new church vestibule in 1891 and the extended schoolhouse in 1893 and the Redemption County Records building in 1894. Each project carried through with the same plumb-true care as the first fence posts on Delia's property in that first April. On a September evening in 1895, they sat on the south porch in the last light of a day that had been warm and productive and without any particular drama, which was what most good days were, and Thomas was inside working on his reading, and Cora was in the barn doing something with the chickens that Delia had decided not to investigate, and Samuel was asleep. And the desert was doing the impossible September sunset thing that it had been doing for as long as Delia had lived there, and that still had not diminished. Roscoe was looking at the fence line along the south boundary, the newest section, rebuilt the previous spring with posts that were even better than the 1882 originals, and he had the builder's look, the eye that saw what could be improved. "What are you thinking about?" she said. He turned and looked at her, and 13 years had not changed the way he looked at her, which was with the full serious attention of someone for whom she was the most interesting subject available. "The upper pasture fence," he said. "I want to replace the posts before winter." "You're always replacing posts before winter," she said, "because winter is harder on posts than people realize," he said. "Is that all you're thinking about?" He smiled, the slow one. "No," he said. "I'm thinking that this is the life I was trying to build in Texas and couldn't, and that I'm glad it didn't work in Texas because it wouldn't have been this." She looked at him. In the September light, in the specific quality of the air that came across the desert at this hour, in the house behind them and the fence line before them, and the sound of her children inside, and the feel of the porch railing his father had taught him to make, with the joints hidden beneath the smooth surface, she felt the completeness of something that had been built correctly from the foundation. "I'm glad too," she said. "For all the same reasons." He reached out and took her hand, the way he had taken it the first time, that evening in July of 1882 when Miguel Morales had told him to marry her, and they had both been standing in the dark pretending not to have heard each other perfectly. He held it the same way, with quiet certainty, with the grip of a man who does not let go of things he has decided to hold. They sat like that in the September evening, watching the desert light change through its impossible colors, red and orange and the deep purple that came just before dark, and Delia thought about a woman in scent. Louis, who had read a letter 17 times and believed in it completely, and she thought about a fence built without being asked for, and a word that had contained everything, and she thought that the word had been true and had remained true through 13 years and 3 children, and a stone fence and a smokehouse, and a porch with hidden joints, and a man who built things at the level that didn't show. And she thought that this was the correct answer to the question of what else he planned to build. The answer was and had always been and would continue to be everything. And everything she had discovered was enough. Everything was more than enough. Everything was the word that had changed her life on a July evening in 1882, and 13 years later it was still true, still being built, still being tended with the same careful precision as the fence posts in the red Arizona earth, plumb and true, and set in stone, holding everything in. Thomas came out to the porch and leaned against his father's shoulder the way 11-year-old boys lean, casually and with complete trust, and Roscoe's arm went around him without either of them interrupting the evening's conversation. And Cora came in from the barn with a report about the chickens that was detailed and unnecessary, and delivered at full volume. And Samuel woke up and needed something. And the porch filled with the ordinary loud specific life of a family on a September evening in Arizona Territory in 1895. And Delia Holloway Kendrick, who had once stood alone in a dark kitchen with her heart hammering, sat in the middle of all of it and felt, in every stone-set post, and every plum-true board, and every warm and ordinary moment of the life she and Roscoe had built together, exactly and completely at home.